and something by John that is a forthcoming lengthy review piece of the Paraboom book. And I just posted something else, which is a paper, sort of a lengthy review piece of Dana Nelkin's new book that I wrote that will be coming out at some point. And one section, like the section called Abilities, I discuss her distinction. I guess this is what people call, I mean, she gives a version of new dispositionalism, you think?
Yes, I take it to be.
So I sort of argued that what we were saying in the last class, that it's not clear how different it is from traditional compatibilism. She distinguishes between ability in the inevitability undermining sense and ability in some other sense. Inevitability undermining and then interference free. So she says people in Frankfurt cases lack the ability in the inevitability undermining sense because inevitability isn't undermined in Frankfurt cases because it is inevitable that they'll do what they do. So they don't have ability in that sense. But they do have it in the interference-free sense. And that just means that the agent in a Frankfurt case is going to actually be able to do what he aims to do. No one's going to interfere with it in the actual sequence. But I think that distinction is useful. I mean, it's a good way of conceptualizing it, but I'm not sure how much that adds because that's just the actual sequence. And I think everybody's got to agree that the agent has the interference-free ability to do otherwise. Otherwise, he wouldn't be morally responsible. And that's what I argue in this section of the paper. Because if you didn't think that agents need the interference-free ability, then you'd be committed to saying that even if the agent had been interfered with, he'd still be morally responsible. But that's something nobody's going to endorse. I mean, if Black actually makes Jones do it, then surely Jones isn't responsible. So clearly the interference-free sense of ability is necessary for moral responsibility. So it's not clear that that adds a whole lot to the debate. But that was relevant to the last section.
Yeah, so Dana Nelkin, Matt has a critical notice of Dana Nelkin's book, and she is kind of following in the footsteps of the new dispositionalists in a lot of ways. Again, she thinks in a Frankfurt case you could have done otherwise, but what that involves is holding fixed the non-interference of Black. So, I mean, I want to say the agent can't do otherwise, but is acting freely, and in acting freely, I hold fixed the non-interference of Black. So, again, it raises the question, is there some substantive difference between her approach and mine, or are they just, as it were, notational variants that get to the same issue? That would be something, again, if someone could see a reason for going in one way rather than the other, that would really be interesting, I think. But okay, and yes, my review, again, is of Paraboom, which Matt uploaded to, or put in Dropbox, is completely optional, but I thought you might want to see it before we talk about the manipulation arguments, the four-case argument. So I focused my review on the four-case argument. And this is, you get a preview of this, and I think so my review is for Science, Culture, and Religion, a new journal, newish journal that's edited by Greg Caruso, and Dana Nelkin will also have a substantial article, review, and then I think Dirk Paraboom will have replies. And I think there will be a tie-in to the blog, Flickers of Freedom. So we're thinking about different possibilities for having a tie-in so people will be able to participate in some kind of discussion. So you get the first crack at this. You get to see at least my essay, and we'll discuss it tomorrow. All right, so first of all, I have these food allergies, and I must have eaten something yesterday, so that's why I'm a little swollen here. So it's not a big deal, but I wanted to mention that. I'm not sure what it was that I was allergic to, but should go down over the course of the day. Let me give you a little background on Paraboom, the overall book, and then we'll just launch into a discussion of libertarianism today using Paraboom as our platform. And So I want to start with his definition of moral responsibility. It's kind of interesting. It's on page 2. You probably don't have the book, so here it is. For an agent to be morally responsible for an action in the relevant sense is for it to be hers in such a way that she would deserve to be blamed if she understood that it was morally wrong, and she would deserve to be praised if she understood that it was morally exemplary or right. So let me again say, so what Pereboom tries to do is, he points out that philosophers use the term moral responsibility in different ways. They give different accounts of it, different definitions of it even, or maybe different, in my terms, different specifications of the concept of moral responsibility. Then they go on to also disagree about the conception. But so what he wants to do is carve out a specification of the concept of responsibility that he thinks is very fundamental to debates about free will and responsibility. This is what he thinks is the, as it were, basic sense, or the basic concept about which we've all been disagreeing. We should conceptualize debates as debates about this notion of responsibility. So again, for an agent to be morally responsible for an action in this sense is for it to be hers, so she has to own it, it's to be hers in such a way that she would deserve to be blamed if she understood that it was morally wrong, and she would deserve to be praised if she understood that it was morally exemplary. He goes on to say, the desert at issue here is basic in the sense that the agent would deserve to be praised, blamed, or praised just because she has performed the action given an understanding of its moral status, and not, for example, merely by virtue of consequentialist or contractualist considerations. Okay, so it's in this basic sense of desert that's not forward-looking in terms of consequences, or doesn't follow, or is not kind of grounded in contractualist considerations. He thinks that's the relevant notion of desert. So one thing to note is that this definition, well, it involves this idea of basic desert, and that's going to really play a big role. He's going to argue that we're not morally responsible in this sense. Now, he thinks we are morally responsible in other, I mean, if you prune out or eliminate the basic desert part, then we can be morally responsible. But he thinks we're not morally responsible in this fundamental way. Also note that this definition is compatible with moral responsibility for morally neutral actions. Remember, I think that you can be morally responsible for an act in virtue of being an apt target for the reactive attitudes, but it may be that your action is not even morally valenced. It may be a morally neutral action. What I think is important is that we mark the distinction between being in control and not being in control. I use the term moral responsibility to mark this distinction. So if an agent's doing a morally neutral act, she can still be, in the relevant sense, in control, so she's morally responsible, unlike a mere animal or someone who has an epileptic seizure and does the same thing in a certain sense. But I think it's useful to be able to mark the distinction between individuals who are, in this at least minimal sense, in control from those who aren't. I use the term moral responsibility, but then it's a further question whether the individual is praiseworthy or blameworthy. And it's a further question whether we ought, all things considered, to praise or blame, and there'll be a whole nuanced set of considerations there. But so all he's saying is, let's say I raise the marker. It may well be the case that this action is mine in a way that's such that if I understood it to be morally exemplary, I would deserve praise. And if I understood it as morally, what's his term?
Wrong.
Morally wrong, then I would deserve blame. But of course, it is morally neutral. So what I'm saying is, his account is completely consistent with moral responsibility for morally neutral acts because it's being put in terms of conditionals or counterfactuals, right? Subjective conditionals. Okay, any question about just that, his definition of moral responsibility? Yeah, Sean?
Yeah, so does this definition of responsibility presuppose a certain account of blameworthiness? So that you're responsible just in case you'd be blameworthy if you understood the action as wrong. So does this presuppose that blameworthiness is a result of your explicit beliefs about the wrongness of actions?
I don't think so. In other words, I don't think he wants to presuppose at least any contentious account of blameworthiness here. Now, I mean, he's going to want to give an account at some point of blameworthiness, but here it's supposed to just be broad enough, I think, to accommodate potentially different accounts. Sophia?
Yeah, I was just thinking that you could fill in this in different ways because you could allow for blameless wrongdoing and also blameworthy right doing, and it wouldn't make any difference from Beerbohm's view, really. Right. You can have all kinds of ideas about what it means that you understand that it's wrong. Do you need to explicitly understand it, or do you just need to feel it in some sense? And all kinds of stuff you could fill in there.
It could be implicit, I think, on his view, the understanding and questioning. I think he, in the past, has defined it a little differently. Like, I recall that he said something like, for an agent to be morally responsible for an action is for it to be hers in such a way that she would deserve to be blamed if it was morally wrong, and she would deserve to be praised if it was morally exemplary. Now he's putting in if she understood it to be. And it's a little tricky because I think my own view is, well, no, I'm not going to pick a fight here about this definition.
What I do think that he's committed to, which kind of diverges from what you have said at some points, is that in like a Maria full of grace case, if she's only a little bit blameworthy, it has to be because it's only a little bit wrong, or because she was under such a huge psychological pressure that it was really hard to do the right thing. But there's a limit to how much you can price apart blameworthiness and wrongness, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. He definitely thinks if it's wrong.
And also also you can't really price apart moral responsibility and blameworthiness, except in cases, of course, when the action was neutral or praiseworthy.
Right. So there's more a little bit more flexibility in my account, or the connections are less stringent. Though I think, as we said before, I do want to mark a different strategy I could take, where I could say, in Maria full of grace, morally responsible, wrong action, blameworthy, but all things considered, we ought not blame, and that's also available to me. In any case, all right, so what he distinguishes, he goes on to, of course, accept the distinction that's in the literature between leeway incompatibilism and source incompatibilism. I think I've mentioned that the two main engines driving incompatibilism are worries about freedom to do otherwise, and that's crystallized, I think, in the consequence argument, and then also worries about sourcehood, the requirement that the source of the action be in the agent in some sense, and not, I mean, one way of putting it is, in order to be morally responsible, one can't, it must be the case that one can't trace one's action to deterministic causes that are out of one's control, external one to oneself and out of one's control. That's one way of putting the source worry, of course, in an incompatibilist way. So the leeway incompatibilist is an incompatibilist because she thinks we need alternative possibilities. We need freedom in the sense of freedom to do otherwise, or regulative control. Okay? The source incompatibilist is an incompatibilist because she takes it that we need internal source, and we need the source to be internal to us. Does that make sense? I mean, these are analytically separate views. Now, some people are both. You know, some incompatibilists are incompatibilists for both reasons. They think we need alternative possibilities. It must be for them that the future is a garden of forking paths, that we have alternative possibilities. And then they may also accept that the source has to be within the agent. So remember, I mentioned Michael Della Rocca's paper in News, Frankfurt Flickers and Fischer or something like that. That's a good example of someone who thinks we need both alternative possibilities and sourcehood in order to be responsible. But in his case, he thinks sourcehood is what grounds or explains our responsibility, and alternative possibilities have to be present because they're a sign, a necessary sign of the presence of this other thing, sourcehood. You could be an even more robust proponent of the necessity of both leeway and sourcehood if you thought each in itself grounds is sufficient to ground responsibility, the presence of robust alternatives and sourcehood. So you might, all I'm saying is there are various options here. Let me also point to the analytic separability of sourcehood and freedom to do otherwise. Paraboom, as we have discussed, accepts the Frankfurt cases as showing that we do not need alternative possibilities in order to be responsible. And he constructs an indeterministic Frankfurt case, the tax evasion case that we've talked about, so-called buffer zone cases, tax evasion case in his case. So he thinks we don't need freedom, at least in the sense of robust alternative possibilities, to be responsible. That's not what our leeway doesn't ground our responsibility. But he thinks, nevertheless, we do need sourcehood, and that's where he thinks he's a source incompatibilist, not a leeway incompatibilist. Okay. In fact, I published a paper in January of 1982 in the Journal of Philosophy. It was called Responsibility and Control. And in that paper, I marked this position, a source incompatibilist. I didn't call it source incompatibilism, but I said, look, even if Frankfurt has shown us that we don't need alternative possibilities to be responsible, there's still the problem that if determinism obtains, it flows through the actual sequences I put in, and basically what I was saying is an incompatibilist might say, okay, you don't really need alternative possibilities because we could have an indeterministic Frankfurt case. But if determinism obtains, that's a separate problem. I didn't call it the problem of sourcehood, but okay, yeah, Dimitri.
So basically, source incompatibilism is a kind of a causal limitation. So you have to have an agent that's separated from the all previous causal chains, right?
From the deterministic causal.
From deterministic.
Yeah, because they're okay with indeterministic causal chains, but it can't be you can't be part of a deterministic causal chain, because then the source of your behavior would be outside of you. I mean, you could point to something even prior to your birth, which is such that it's part of this deterministic causal chain that then issues in your behavior. And that's a separate worry, and it's important to see that from the alternative possibilities worry. And there's a whole group, not just Paraboom, but a whole group of philosophers. Norman Kretzmann held this view, Eleanor Stump, and David Hunt, and a whole bunch of others. I can't think, maybe others have other names. They are all libertarians in that they think responsibility requires indeterminism. But they accept, all of them, the Frankfurt cases as showing, in some version or another, as showing that we don't need alternative possibility. But in that 1982 article I wrote, I published, I really emphasized that even if Frankfurt has succeeded in showing that we don't need alternative possibilities, there's further work to be done by a compatibilist. Now, I think that work can be done, and I mean, I think there's no reason to think determinism in itself, or there's no decisive or strong reason to think determinism in itself, and apart from ruling out alternative possibilities, deletes or gets rid of or threatens responsibility. But these people, like Eleanor Staub, David Hunt, and most perhaps saliently Dirk Pereboom, they think, okay, we don't need alternative possibilities, but we need a kind of sourcehood that's inconsistent with determinism.
And some people think it would be inconsistent with indeterminism as well.
Yeah.
Like Galen Strawson's ultimate responsibility argument.
And leeway incompatibilism once again?
Yes, leeway incompatibilism thinks that moral responsibility requires freedom to do otherwise. Mm-hmm. And that's why determinism rules out responsibility, because it rules out freedom to do it. Yeah.
What's the title of your review? I don't see it in the Dropbox. Maybe it's... and what's the file name?
Review of Free Will.
Well...
Is it in
a review of free will?
Yeah.
I mean, okay, it's not by Dirk Pereboom. It's
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it says,
sorry about that.
Yeah, it says by Dirk Pereboom, and I was like, well.
And that's for tomorrow, by the way. That's, I mean, I talk about the 4-case argument. So that's what I focus on. So you'll find that.
Change the name of it. Well, I think that'll change it for everybody.
Yeah.
So I'll just say Fischer Review of Free Will.
Oh, I thought you were going to say brilliant review. Okay, you shy?
Just a quick question. So if one were to say that robust alternatives are necessary but don't ground responsibility, would you consider that a sort of source incompatibilism, or it's not really cashed out in either way?
It's messy, but I would say any view that holds that alternative possibilities are necessary. Well,
because De La Rocca would say that, right? He would say it's necessary, it just doesn't ground.
You know what? I don't think we'd have to go back. I think Michael McKenna, in some of his work, is the person who named the view source incompatibilism. I don't know if he also named leeway incompatibilism, but I know he gave the view that name. I didn't ever give it a name, though I talked about it in my 1981 article. And what I don't know is whether he explicitly distinguished between views that say we require alternative possibilities as a sign of something that does in fact ground reason, or whether he thought of, let's say, leeway incompatibilism as any incompatibilism that requires alternative possibilities, even flickers of freedom. So I don't know the answer to that question. We'd have to look at, but in any case, in Pereboom's case, this is interesting because he considers himself a source incompatibilist, not a leeway incompatibilist, but he does think there are alternative possibilities. In his case, they're just not robust, because remember, Joe is thinking about whether to cheat on his taxes. And the only way he can be honest is by having a certain thought about morality. And so he has that power, the power to focus on moral consideration. But what Pereboom wants to say is that's not a robust alternative. So he does think that there are alternatives. They're just not robust, but he calls himself a source incompatible. So maybe the best way to think of, here's another way of making the distinction. Okay, there's source. Here, let's... Okay. There's source, incompatibilism, and leeway. And maybe these are both, one way of thinking about them is they're both views about what grounds or explains responsibility. Okay? And so the source, the leeway incompatibilist says, responsibility requires alternative possibilities, and not just as a sign of something else, but because the presence of the alternative possibilities is what grounds or explains responsibility. Whereas a source incompatibilist is going to say, no, even if they are present, they matter only because they're the sign of something else, which is what really grounds responsibility, and that is internal source. And maybe that's the best way to understand. Okay, maybe that. I'd have to go back and look at the McKenna paper. All right. Any comments or questions so far? All right, so this is, so Pereboom, part of his overall project is presenting a Frankfurt case in an indeterministic context in which there aren't allegedly robust alternatives. Remember, I pointed you to Chris Franklin's critique there, where he says the omission is, you have to think not just of actions, but omissions. It's kind of like Sherlock. There's a Sherlock Holmes story in which what's really important is that the dog didn't bark one night, you know, like, so sometimes omissions are even more important than actions. And what Franklin says, not Frankfurt, Franklin says, is what's really going on is in the tax evasion case, Joe is responsible in virtue of omitting to think about moral considerations. So that omission, he thinks, is what's crucial. And he had the power to think about morality, and that would be a robust alternative possibility. So, and there is a further, there's a reply in this book. So, you know, I commend the chapter on Frankfurt cases to you. I didn't assign it because we just didn't have the time. But there is a further debate between Franklin and Pereboom about it. But, so, he wants to argue that we don't, against leeway, but for source incompatibilism. He believes that we are not morally responsible if our choices and behavior are causally determined by factors outside of our control. That's a very basic view of Pereboom. So we're not responsible if our choices and behavior are caused in a deterministic fashion by factors outside of our control.
So what I was saying earlier is that some people, like Galen Strawson, I think is a good example, thinks that indeterminism would have the same result, that we wouldn't be ultimately responsible for our actions because we're not responsible for all the causal factors that feed into us making the choices that we make.
Right.
And that's true even if determinism is false.
So you can look at Galen Strawson as an impossibilist. He thinks moral responsibility is impossible. So if determinism is true, everything would flow from factors, flow deterministically from factors outside of our control. If indeterminism is true, you know, similarly, he wants to say we wouldn't, even if it's not deterministically flowing, we're not the source of our behavior in the right way. Interestingly, so he's an impossibilist. His student, Saul Smolansky, when I take my allergy pill, sometimes I say things like Small Smolansky when it should be Saul Smolansky. But anyway, he, student of Galen Strawson, wants to further develop that same view that if determinism is true, we're not responsible. If indeterminism is true, we're not responsible. Responsibility in this basic dessert sense is impossible. But he thinks, in Smolansky's case, he thinks we should continue to believe in certain contexts that we're responsible, and that socially we ought to support the illusion that we're responsible, because the illusion is very important. So Pereboom is Pereboom, let me say, is not in the same camp with Strawson, with Galen Strawson and Smolansky, but he's close. He doesn't think, he's not an impossibilist, though, as we'll see, he thinks indeterminism is consistent with moral responsibility, but he thinks it's highly unlikely that we have the kind of control that would be required. That is, it's highly unlikely that if indeterminism is true, we would have the kind of control required for responsibility, and it involves agent causation. So he's not an impossibilist, but he's a highly improbabilist, you could say. And so what he does is he, instead of going the route of Smolansky, who thinks we need the illusion that we're free will, what he wants to do is sketch out an alternative picture of responsibility, that would be one way of putting it, which doesn't involve basic desert, but which allows us to preserve many of the same practices that we have, allows us to preserve what's really valuable in our practices and defensible, while eliminating indignation, resentment, hatred, and the belief that we actually deserve the reactive attitudes, even the non-retributive ones like moral praise and reward and gratitude. He doesn't think we deserve praise or gratitude in a basic sense, but he thinks we can give accounts of let's say, praise and blame that allow us to keep the practice of praising and blaming and keep what's really valuable and upon reflection, appealing, without adverting to this basis in desert. Okay? So, and he thinks we can keep love, for instance, which, you know, you might have thought that love requires free will in some very robust sense. Okay. I talk about, in my review, I talk a little bit about this film called Bruce Almighty with Jim Carrey and Morgan Freeman. Not a great film, but in the film, the character played by, first of all, Morgan Freeman plays God in this, and the character played by Jim Carrey is trying to make the character played by Jennifer Aniston fall in love with him, and God gives him special powers, you know, for a certain amount of time. Morgan Freeman's character, God, gives Jim Carrey these special powers, but he says, whatever you do, do not mess with her free will. And I think the idea is, even if you're trying to make someone fall in love, you can't really, it's not going to be genuine love unless the other individual freely accepts you, or freely falls in love with you, or at least maybe freely stays in love with you. And what, and various libertarians have argued essentially that way. I mean, there's, of course, a history of theological thinking about accepting God, where it's not really genuine unless it's done freely. And of course, there's complications on that. But there's also Robert Kane's really interesting discussion in his work, especially his book, The Significance of Free Will, in which he, again, argues that there's a kind of freedom, a kind of love that's very, very important to us that requires free will in the sense of alternative possibilities. And I think he's willing to say, if you consider romantic love, it may well be the case that we don't freely fall in love with someone, but there are occasions and opportunities as we're falling in love to step back and ask the question, do I want to continue in this relationship? Do I want to maintain the love? So do things that say sustain the love. That we have an opportunity at that point to either freely accept the love or not. We have an option, an out. And if we don't, then he thinks it's not the most genuine kind of love, or not the most important kind of love. And Pereboom has a nice argument against this view. I mean, he wants to argue, he starts, I think, with the analogy of the love we have toward our children or our parents, where it's quite clear that it's not based in anything about free will. I mean, a parent might deeply love a baby that hasn't ever acted freely or acted at all. It's just a more direct kind of relationship that's not based in freedom. Same thing with our parents. And what he wants to say is you can extend these considerations even to romantic love, where in romantic love you might fall in love with someone for reasons that are hard to identify, but typically aren't explicit and conscious, and it really isn't a matter of free will. There's, I think, a great Elvis Presley song that's the refrain to which is, I can't help falling in love with you. Well, that's something I think many of us have experienced. You just fall in love with someone. It's not as though you do it freely, and I can't help falling in love with you. Or there's another song called It Had to Be You. Well, it's not as though we have this kind of freedom there in the process of falling. And then once you have fallen in love, it's rather difficult then to step back and kind of get the detachment that might be required for alternative possibilities, or at least that's the kind of thing he argues. So, I mean, I just want to say that's just one example of an important attitude that we have that arguably is part of gluing us together as persons. It's part of the fabric or the connective tissue of interpersonal relationships.
Where does he write about
love?
this? Yeah.
It's in, there's an important chapter of his first book where he, and let me just get you but in the second book, it's unfortunately not in the material that I assigned. There was only, but let's see, let me give you the exact. It's on pages 190 to 193 of this new book. And he's got a whole chapter on the meaning of life, life's projects, and love, gratitude and love. So he thinks love is just one example of, and gratitude is another, respect is another. I mean, those are more attitudes where, yeah, I guess love is an attitude as well. You might have thought it required freedom and therefore, or control, freedom or control. But in fact, what he wants to argue is we can still have these attitudes even in absent having the kind of control that would be also the basis of desert-based responsibility. He just doesn't think we can have that kind of control. Now, again, some moral responsibility skeptics will conclude that we have to radically revise our practices. We can't really keep anything like, love, respect, gratitude, blame, punishment. But what Paraboom's whole project is to conceptualize love, respect, gratitude, and also blame and punishment in such a way that we can see that we can either keep the entire package that we already have, or we have to adjust the package a little and we'll be able to keep what we really care about. Okay, yes?
Yeah, I try to play a little devil's advocate regarding the love requires libertarian free will, because I don't really believe that, because I'm a compatibilist. I remember I said this to Pierre when we met in Budapest, and he was like, yeah, maybe, because he always answers that. But I think that people who argue, like Robert Kane, for instance, that you need libertarian free will to have true love, I don't think perhaps they believe that the process of loving requires libertarian free will. I think it's more, I mean, we can imagine a science fiction scenario where they have very human-like robots and someone falls in love with a robot and then someone else says that this is an illusion, you're not really in love with him because it's just a robot after all. There's nothing there to truly love because this is a thing that only follows its programming. And maybe in some kind of analogy, people like Robert Kane thinks that we need to be the kind of creatures who have libertarian free will for real love to be, for us to be apt targets for real love.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think Paraboom would even deny that, right? But you're right to point out that maybe a libertarian would have a more complex view about the relationship between love and libertarian free will. That it wouldn't necessarily be part of the process of falling in love or maintaining love. Although I think Kane, as I recall, does say in The Significance of Free Will, I think it's there, that book, The Significance of Free Will, that maintaining love, even if we can't exercise free will in falling in love, maintaining it does, you make a choice to stay in this relationship or not that's free, and without that he thinks it would kind of be empty. I mean, I do think that is part of what's going on in Morgan Freeman's, imploring Jim Carrey's character not to mess with her free will.
Yeah, but that could also be a warning against bypassing some kind of rational propensity. So it's hard to interpret these kinds of like movie cases.
Yes. Okay, Matt?
I just wanted to ask, so dessert plays a really important, or the notion of basic dessert plays a really important role here. And does he offer an analysis of dessert that's deeper than just that it needs to be basic, so it can't be dessert mediated through consequentialist concerns? Because, I mean, it seems like we really would want to know what dessert means so that we can tell, so that we can tell if we have an account according to which you deserve it. But if it's unanalyzed, it's difficult to know
so
what conditions would satisfy him.
Good point. I don't think he does. He just says what it's not. It's not a dessert that's based in contractualist consideration or in consequentialist consideration. Now there is, I know that he helped to edit, he co-edited an issue of Philosophical Explorations recently. There's a journal, Philosophical Explorations, and he co-edited. Did you contribute to that?
I refereed a paper, so I knew about it.
Right, so it was a paper on, a volume on dessert. And I know, and you could look at that journal for some, that issue, Philosophical Explorations, the special issue on dessert. But I don't know that he's ever said anything more. And what is, one thing that's kind of good to note is that there is increasingly kind of attention to this issue of the proper way to characterize I don't know how to put it more abstractly. I'll just give you the examples. Ravisa and I, of course, use the term aptness. So to be morally responsible, an individual has to be an apt or appropriate target of the reactive attitudes. Paraboom more specifically focuses on desert. So it's not aptness, but desert. And I think they're different notions. Ravisa and I didn't really specify desertness specifically. Other theorists, and Matt has referred to Justin DeArms and Jacobson. Jacobson and is it Daniel Jacobson, Justin DeArms and Jacobson, and they explore the idea of using the notion of fittingness rather than either aptness or appropriateness or desert. And what I think some of the recent literature, including Michael McKenna's book, explores whether there might be differences, important differences between going in the aptness way or the desert way or the fittingness way. And I think that's a kind of more recent development in the last 5-8 years. I just thought, well, and I still think it's best to leave it unspecified, but I can see Paraboom is, I suppose, saying if you just say apt, you could mean apt understood in a consequentialist way, and that might not well be what people are really thinking about when they're thinking of moral responsibility. Okay? Well, what I'd like to do then, that's the overall view, and then I'm not going to go through all the details of this article, but I want to kind of focus in on the basic worry for event causal libertarianism. Let me just say, on page 30 and 31, he distinguishes 3 kinds of libertarianism: event causal, agent causal, and non-causal. So that is something to keep in mind in the back of our minds. We're going to be focusing first on event causal. This chapter is about event causal libertarianism. So remember, libertarianism is the view that we are free. Typically, a libertarian argues, typically though I suppose not invariably, that freedom to do otherwise is required for moral responsibility. We've seen the source incompatibilists, who are also libertarians, would deny that, so would typically not require alternatives. But the libertarian says we are free, indeterminism is required for freedom, and therefore indeterminism is true. And you have agent causal non-causal and event-causal versions of libertarianism. You can think of how does libertarianism relate to the consequence argument. The libertarian typically would accept the consequence argument, but as a valid argument, but simply reject the assumption of causal determinism. Remember, that's the way you start the consequence argument. You say, suppose, for the sake of argument, that causal determinism is true. Now we can deduce from that supposition that we're not free to do it. So the libertarian's response is, I'm not going to accept the premise. I'm not going to accept that. I could accept it as a working hypothesis, but now we do, it's a reductio. We get to the conclusion that we're not free, but we are free, so I'm going to do modus tollens, right? I'm going to go back and reject the premise. Yes, Artur?
Must a libertarianist be an incompatibilist?
Yes, let me say, there are different ways of using the terms. Definitely are, but I think the standard way has it that libertarianism entails incompatibilism. I think that's the clearest, but it's more than that. It's also the view that we are in fact free. There are incompatibilists like, you know, Galen Strawson, Saul Smolansky, all the skeptics. They're incompatibilists, but they don't think we're free at all because they think determinism is incompatible with responsibility and indeterminism is. But so yeah, I take it that libertarianism entails incompatibles. I think if you read the blog, Flickers of Freedom, you'll see that some philosophers are wanting to use these terms so you could have libertarian compatibilism or something, but that's not that helpful. Now, I would want to say one other thing, though. Some people use this term that Peter van Inwagen hates, and I dislike. Okay, Sophia was saying, Dirk Pereboom likes to say maybe, and I like to not hate, but just dislike. Okay, so I think Peter might be more of a hater, but he's a very nice guy, though. My good friend, my very good friend. But, and he is. I think Peter is a wonderful philosopher, and he is a great friend. But I think he's more inclined to say that he hates the term libertarian freedom. He said that in a talk that was, you know, at the keynote talk at an Inland Northwest Philosophy Conference that's been published, right? Do you know what the name of that talk is? I don't know. But in any case, it may be in his defense of Mysterianism, but in any case, what he says is he hates that term because it's often used just to mean that you have freedom to do otherwise. So people say libertarian freedom, and by that they mean freedom to do otherwise. But I think the reason Peter hates it is because, you know, a classical compatibilist thinks we often have freedom to do otherwise, even if determinism is true. And let me just say, certain classical compatibilists think you need that kind of freedom to be morally responsible. Keith Lehrer is a good example. Keith Lehrer resists and rejects the Frankfurt cases, thinks determinism is completely compatible with freedom to do otherwise. So he believes we have libertarian freedom. It's just not in the sense standardly associated with libertarianism. So, I mean, I just want to say, there is a usage of that term, libertarian freedom. It's not libertarianism, but it's libertarian freedom that just suggests that you have or perhaps need alternative possibilities. But that's not a good usage. I mean, okay. Yeah.
I don't know if people really use it in that way. I don't think anyone does. I think that when people say libertarian free will or libertarian freedom, they mean that as the kind of freedom, one of the kinds of freedoms that Robert Kane says we have, Tim O'Connor says we have, Mark Balaga says we have.
Right.
One of these kinds of freedoms,
Right.
You group them together and call them libertarian free will.
That's the way they should. I agree with you.
Kind of free will that libertarians want.
Yeah.
And it's usually
Exactly.
used by compatibilists who say, look, take this agent, let's assume he has libertarian free will. That is your kind of free will.
Yeah, you know, I use it in this article I consulted you on that, you know, some people believe that we need libertarian free will to have moral responsibility in this basic desert sense, whereas we can have another kind of moral responsibility with mere compatibilist freedom. And I don't think that's a problem. I think one reason, okay, I shouldn't say what he really means because you know him, I don't know him. But it seems when you read him as if one of his problems with the use libertarian free will is that he has this idea that there is like only one concept of free will, and we all discuss the very same concept,
right.
and probably also only one concept of moral responsibility. And then people go like, oh, you know, there are different concepts, we can discuss
right.
which one of these concepts is morally relevant or
right.
what one thing. And he's like, no, that's not true, there's like only
good.
one concept.
I think that's a good point. So there are two, I think, so first of all, I agree completely that we should use that term, libertarianism or libertarian free will, to denote the kind of freedom that requires the absence of determinism. That's important. And I agree that in the secular debates about free will, typically we would use that term, libertarian freedom or libertarian free will, to denote, you know, the kind of freedom that's wanted by Robert Kane or Laura Ekstrom or Tim O'Connor, the indeterministic free will. But actually, if you look at debates about God and free will, they will use, they will use this term libertarian freedom to mean freedom to do otherwise. But I think you're right, that the reason Peter Van Inwagen doesn't like that term is, there are many reasons, and one is what I said, is that he thinks it should be restricted to indeterministic freedom and not just freedom to do otherwise. But maybe even more importantly is what you said, that he thinks we all we have a grasp, human beings, and remember this was part of my argument in my Peter Stroson paper, or a paper comparing Peter Stroson's view and my view, mine with Mark Avisa. He thinks, Peter Van Inwagen, that we have some grasp, some intuitive grasp of free will, of the kind of possibility that's involved in free will. He thinks we can also recognize that it's not the same kind of possibility as logical possibility or mere physical possibility in the sense of compatibility with the physical laws, or even metaphysical possibility. It's not the same notion of possibility. Surely it's not the same as logical possibility, because it's logically possible that I go to my office in Riverside in 5 minutes and open the door. It's logically possible, but it's not possible in the free will. So, I mean, if I'm tied to, if Matt is particularly bored with me one day and doesn't want me to come back for the afternoon session, and he ties me to my bed and he, you know, tells Tina that, you know, everything's okay, I'm just going over to the room early. You know, I can't come under the circumstances, and yet it's logically possible that I come, you know, it's metaphysically possible. So free will possibility is not the same as these others, but he thinks we can't give a reductive analysis of it, of the concept, but we can all grasp it. And what he is really fighting against there, well, first of all, he's arguing against the possibility of just expecting, or he thinks we shouldn't expect to be able to give a reductive account of the concept. It's just something we can say certain things about, but we can't fully explicate. But he also thinks it's important to conceptualize debates in such a way that we're disagreeing. And if, let's say, I'm a compatibilist, and Simon, of course, is an incompatibilist, and we're debating about free will, he doesn't want to conceptualize it in such a way that we're just talking past each other. Simon's talking about the incompatibilist sense of free will and responsibility, and I'm talking about the compatible sense. So he thinks it's best and most accurate, and therefore the best thing, to kind of conceptualize us as having this shared inchoate or intuitive grasp of a kind of freedom that we all think is present sometimes. And now we're trying to give an account of it, and we're disagreeing. So that's another reason why he hates the term libertarian freedom, because it suggests we all have, I'm talking about the compatibilist freedom, you're talking about incompatibilist freedom. And then, yeah, so you're right, Sophia, that's a good point. All right, so let's talk about this disappearing agent argument. That's really the fundamental worry about indeterminism. And it, again, going back I always try and make the simple point. I mean, because I really think that's important. And remember, I began by the course by saying there are two. I mean, if you think of the dilemma of determinism, if determinism is true, then we have to do what we do. There's a kind of necessity, and therefore we're not morally responsible. We're not in control because of that necessity. But the parallel problem for indeterminism is, if indeterminism is true, everything is random or arbitrary, and therefore I don't have control, and therefore I'm not responsible. So there are two different ways of getting at the problem of control, one from the deterministic side and one from the indeterminate side. So this disappearing agent objection is one way of crystallizing that worry that if indeterminism were true, I wouldn't be in control. It wouldn't be up to me. I would disappear. One way I like to put it is, if I'm morally responsible, I make a difference to the world. That's one intuitive idea. And if determinism is true, then I'm not a difference maker. I can't really do otherwise. But if indeterminism is true, it's not I who's making the difference. It's there's a difference that gets made, but it's not really I who's doing it. So this is an attempt at really specifying it. So it's on page 32, right in the middle there. I'm just going to read it from Paraboom on page 32. The disappearing agent objection. Consider a decision that occurs in a context in which the agent's moral motivations favor that decision, and her prudential motivations favor her refraining from making it. So it's this conflict between morality and prudence. And actually, Robert Kane, in his work, talks about these cases a lot. He talks about a woman, a businesswoman, who's going to an important meeting, and she sees that someone needs her help, and it's this conflict between morality and prudence. And the strengths, this is important for now at least, the strengths of these motivations are in equipoise, so they're equal, roughly. On an event-causal libertarian picture, the relevant causal conditions antecedent to the decision, i.e. the occurrence of certain agent involving events, do not settle whether the decision will occur, but only render the occurrence of the decision about 50% probable. In fact, because no occurrence of antecedent events settles whether the decision will occur, and only antecedent events are causally relevant, nothing settles whether the decision will occur. Thus, it can't be that the agent or anything about the agent settles whether the decision will occur, and she therefore will lack the control required for basic desert moral responsibility. So again, this is an attempt at getting at this worry that in an indeterministic world, the agent lacks the kind of control required for moral responsibility. So the idea is, the reasons are in equipoise. There's roughly equally strong reason to be moral and to be prudent. And on an event, we're not now allowing ourselves agent causation. We're just talking about event causal libertarianism. So all the events, which include the agent's recognition of reasons or consideration of reasons, all the events prior to the choice or the decision are such that there's roughly a 50% probability that the agent will choose the moral thing, 50% chance that the agent will choose the prudential thing. These are objective probabilities and not just, as it were, subjective probabilities from the agent's perspective. And when the agent goes one way rather than the other, it doesn't seem to be the case that she made the difference. I mean, there are worlds, in other words, in which she chooses one way. There's worlds in which she chooses the other way, but all those worlds have exactly the same past as the actual world. So it's this dissipating, she doesn't seem to make a difference. How could she make a difference? And if she doesn't make a difference, then how could the agent have control? That's the worry. So does everyone, now I want to say there's a related worry that's in the literature. It's the rollback argument, which Pereboom also talks about. And I want to get that out right now. We can talk about both together, because I want to hear what you think about the event causal picture and about the disappearing agent. But does everybody see the disappearing agent problem? Why it's a problem? All right, so I do want to just read to you. So famously, so one thing, I think the rollback argument is getting at a similar worry, but I think it may be a bit different in that, one thing I think is going on is Pereboom's argument is specifically targeting what might be called reductionism. That is, that all causally relevant facts, or all relevant facts, are reduced to events, whereas the rollback argument is actually something that can target even agent causal libertarianism. And in fact, Peter van Inwagen, when he originally introduced the rollback argument, introduced it with a target of agent causal libertarianism. So, though it's also true that subsequently philosophers have read it or interpreted it as a general argument against any kind of indeterminism. But, so I think, let me just say, the basic worries that are driving the disappearing agent argument and the rollback argument are similar, but I think the rollback argument is intended as, and probably can be appropriately interpreted as, a broader argument, and the disappearing agent argument is targeted to event causal libertarianism. But let's just do the rollback really. And I think actually, okay, well, here it is. It's on page 35. Suppose that some agent S, to be careful here, this is Mark Balaguer's statement of the rollback argument. The rollback argument originally was developed by Peter van Inwagen. Suppose that some agent S is torn between two options, A and B, and eventually chooses A in a torn decision sort of way. And now suppose that God rolls back the universe and replays the decision. If the decision is underdetermined in the matter of torn decision, whatever that is, a certain kind of indeterminism, then if God played the decision 100 times, we should expect that S would choose A and B about 50 times each. It seems to be a matter of chance or luck what she chose, and to the extent that this is right, it seems that S didn't author or control the decision. At the very least, it seems that the element of chance or luck here diminishes S's authority and control. So the rollback argument, I think, it's not the same argument as the disappearing agent argument. The disappearing agent argument is about reductionism to events, but they both highlight this element of lack of control. Both the rollback argument and the disappearing agent argument highlight a certain kind of lack of control that flows from there being no differences, no relevant differences between the worlds in which the agent does the thing in question and doesn't. So let's say, this is, I think, a very, very deep problem. The problem of luck or lack of control on the indeterministic picture. Let's say indeterminism is true. And let's say I raise my marker at a certain time. I raise it now. It follows from indeterminism that everything about the universe, together with the laws of nature, could be held fixed and I not have raised my marker. So as opposed to the situation under determinism, we don't have an entailment between the past and the laws of nature and my action.
And importantly, all the facts about you, all the facts that we would be inclined to explain his behavior in terms of, his desires, intentions, values, etc., all that could be the same and yet give rise to a different outcome at the second time God lets time go forward.
Yeah. So what's so interesting about this, I think, or one thing that's so fascinating, is the very thing that allows for leeway is giving us the problem here. In other words, when we had deterministic picture, we saw that the past and the laws entail my choices and behavior. That's what got the consequence argument going. I don't have now alternative possibilities. Now if you say, okay, I'm going to fix that, I'm going to fix that by introducing the lack of an entailment. Now I have causal indeterminism. I still have causation, so it's not random in a certain way. But I have causation by reason states, like some of the causes are my recognitions of reasons. So it's not wild caprice or arbitrariness or randomness. I have causation by reasons, but I have that now leeway because I don't build I don't build an entailment in. That very thing that's so attractive in giving us leeway now gets us into trouble, because now, right, as Matt put it, nothing about the agent makes the decisive difference as to what happens. So, you know, you can either run the disappearing agent argument or the rollback argument. So when I do this, when I raise my marker, God could just play back the universe, okay, rewind the universe to a time just prior. And we're assuming now indeterminism. And now he replays it, or he lets it play itself out 100 times or 1,000 times. Doesn't really matter. What will happen is, if I'm in equipoise, rough equipoise, then roughly 50% of the time I will raise my marker, and 50% of the time I won't. I don't think it matters. Let me just say, let's say there was strong reason to make a philosophical point, so that maybe 80% of the time I raise my pen and 20% of the time I don't. If there's really no difference in me just prior, you know, it doesn't really matter if it's 50-50 or 80-20, it just seems out of my control what happens. And let me just say one more thing. The way Van Inwagen originally put it, it was in the context of something that mattered morally. It wasn't just my raising my marker, but it was someone robbing the poor box of a church. So someone, you know, who needed some money or thought he needed some money robs a poor box of a church. But it's in an indeterministic world, and so he pleads to the judge using this rollback argument, and he says, yes, I did rob the poor box, and I did it for certain reasons, but it's just unfair to hold me accountable for this, because after all, if God had rewound the universe to a time just prior and held everything about me fixed, everything about my character, everything about what I accepted, what principles I accepted and what I focused on, and then let it play out, you know, 60% of the time I would have robbed the poor box, but 40% of the times I wouldn't. It's just unfair for me. It's unfair to hold me accountable, because nothing made the difference between this world and those worlds. One more way of putting it is that, you know, it's like you're holding me accountable for being in this world rather than those worlds, but nothing about me is any different in those worlds. It's just unfair. So I'm going to summarize and say, I do think the rollback and the disappearing agent arguments are getting at something similar, but they are different as well, and that the disappearing agent argument is targeting event causal libertarianism specifically. But they're both getting at this problem of luck. And of course, Al Mealy has been one of the contemporary philosophers who's really developed the problem of luck as a significant challenge. But Peter Van Inwagen and others have also been deeply aware of it. And this problem is what caused Peter to be a Mysterian. He's not an impossibilist. He does think determinism would rule out freedom and responsibility. But he thinks the rollback argument, and presumably the disappearing agent argument, though I don't know that he explicitly addressed that, I think that's Pericles' innovation. But in any case, he thinks it's a mystery how we could be in control in an indeterministic world. It's a puzzle. It's a deep mystery. But he thinks he's more confident that we are free than he is that this mystery is, you know, going to be unsolvable. He doesn't see how to solve it. At some point in an essay on free will, he says, I must choose the puzzling, I must choose between the inconceivable and the puzzling. The inconceivable is that determinism is compatible with responsibility, but so he's going to choose the puzzling. Did I say that wrong? The inconceivable is that determinism is compatible with freedom. The puzzling is that indeterminism is. He prefers the puzzling to the inconceivable. One last point about that. It's weird because he thinks that, as I said, he thinks that if he were convinced that determinism is true, he'd go back and rewrite the argument for the consequence harmony. He would reject principle beta. So I guess he might say, right now it's inconceivable to him that determinism is compatible with responsibility. But in the future, if he were in the hypothetical circumstance in which he were convinced that determinism is true, then it would become conceivable. But I'm not sure that that really makes. But okay, so let's go. What do you think? Are there ways? I want to especially hear from libertarians, but anyone who wants to reply to these arguments. Okay, so let's see. Joe, Dan. Anton, did you have something? Or no? I didn't see. Okay, I'm sorry, I thought I saw. Okay, Joe, Dan, Dimitri, and then Sophia, because I want to make sure everyone gets a chance. Okay, Joe.
So I guess one clarificatory point that I think might sort of shed light on what's exactly at stake here is that suppose that you think that, I mean, could a libertarian say, okay, so maybe in the cases where we really are split 50-50 or something like that, we, in those cases, it's not clear or obvious that we have freedom, but it's okay because these are very, very sort of contrived cases where in any sort of practical case, I mean, so it depends on how you have a theory of action, but it seems like in a case where, I guess like the case where the guy's deciding whether to move to New York or stay somewhere else, I mean, tiny trivial considerations that normally wouldn't play any weight in the decision might come to play weight. So maybe he really likes pizza and knows that New York has good pizza or something like that, and that might not be relevant at all to his normal decision making, but it becomes a bigger factor, something like that. But then I guess maybe that's then sort of more deterministic, where if you, so does that fall more towards determinism, where if you always have considerations in favor of one, you just aren't fully aware of them, then you're not actually, there's no indeterminism.
Somebody like Kane wants to focus just on these 50-50 cases because he thinks in that case, if there's indeterminism, then either way you go could be explained in terms of your reasons, right? But if it were not 50-50, then that would be more worrisome for him.
So even in the cases where it might appear to initially be 50-50, but it's not actually 50-50,
yeah. It's still problematic.
Yeah. Because I guess even if it's 99-1, if you run the case 100 times and you expect your expected value is still 1 for that other time, you'd want to be able to explain why you did it.
Yeah. So I think the rollback argument's pretty clear that, like, if the person robs the poor box but can say, look, there's no difference between the one world in which I do otherwise and this world and the 99 worlds where I don't, then it still might seem unfair to blame him. He could say, it wasn't really in my control because there is a context in which everything is the same about me, and I did that. I did conform, to morality. I didn't rob the poor. So I'm not sure that it really matters what the percentages are. I think Van Inwagen goes on to suggest that. But okay, Dan?
So, I'm a libertarian, and I usually feel the force of this objection pretty heavily. So I'll say that before I go.
Okay.
So I don't think it's like a silly objection, or either of them are silly objections.
No.
But I guess I would like to say a couple things about them. One issue seems to be that Pervum keeps on using this word settle. Oh, nothing about the agent settles it. It's like, what is settle supposed to mean? Is it supposed to mean determine? Well, no, it doesn't. That's the view. That's not an objection. That's the view.
Right.
So you might think it's just silly to say, like, nothing about the agent settles it. It's like, well, yeah, it's indeterministic, but that's what's. It's not clear that's an objection. At least just using that word. Again, I'm kind of just putting my best.
You're marking a certain worry that we need to think about, and he doesn't really say what settling is. He's relying on some intuitive grasp of that notion, but what you're wondering is whether it's fair to expect that something settles the choice or the decision in advance, because then, I mean, that might seem to require determinism. In any case, you're flagging that, okay, which is fair.
And then, so that's just one thing to keep in mind. Another thing is, so you know, when you're talking about Van Inwagen's case of the guy who robs the poor box, and then he tries to use the rollback argument as an excuse. This seems such like such a silly excuse. Who would? I mean, even if you accepted all the premises, you'd be like, oh, I guess it was just lucky that you did. I mean, sometimes people use this word, oh, it's just a matter of luck that I did this. It's like, it wasn't just a matter of luck that you did that. You did it for reasons. It didn't just pop out of the blue. Now, it might be the case that, like Al Mealy says, the cross-world difference is a matter of luck. But the action in either case is not just a matter of luck. So if you did this action, you performed it for reasons, and then he says, well, you know, in the world, you know, nothing's different. It's like, well, you're right to say that in the other world, up to the moment of decision, nothing was different. But in the actual world, you know, if you go to the other world at the moment of decision, yes, it is different. And in the other world, I wouldn't blame you. And in this world, I do. I mean, I think it's just an awful excuse. I would just laugh at someone who gave me that excuse.
I guess I think that the luck claim makes sense. Everything about him, you know, whether or not the reasons gave rise to it, does seem to be, you know, luck might not be the best word, but it does seem to be a matter of luck because just those same reasons might not have. And he could say, look, and I didn't have control over which world was actualized. It turned out to be this one, but it might just as well have been in the other one where I didn't do the action.
So this might be a case in which. So I usually think that this objection should apply just as well to event and agent causal libertarianisms. This might be a case in which maybe agent causal libertarianism, if it can be internally coherent, can make a better case. You say agent
causal. Oh agent. Yeah, sure.
You might say like, yeah, well, in the agent causal, because right now we're discussing the rollback argument, which is supposed to apply to both event causal and agent causal. Yes. But you might think in the event causal case, it's like, well, they're just events, and I didn't have any control over whether this event caused that event, and so on. This, you know, this reason state or this reason event caused that, you know, action. And I mean, in the agent causal case, like, no, well, you caused it for reasons. You settled it. I mean, so you settled it. I take it that's why Parabum thinks you can get past the agent or the disappearing agent objection on agent causal libertarianism. But it might also be a reason to think that the rollback sort of problem isn't as much of a problem for the agent causal view either.
I think if you specify it correctly, it won't be.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, maybe it's worth bringing up Hobart's view, the idea that determinism, that moral responsibility, free will in the sense that would entail moral responsibility, requires determinism because our actions need to be determined by ourselves. And if determinism is false, then nothing determines our actions, so ourselves don't determine our actions. So we actually have to have... Right. Well, and he's wrong. I mean, I think that, is it Thompson? Who has this kind of decisive response where she argues, it's Anscombe, I think, where she just says, look, he's just assuming that all causation is deterministic causation. And that I think is a...
And that is Ann too.
Right, but there is this sort of idea that, right, I want myself to explain the action. And you might think, well, look, in order to explain it, it needs to be the case that given this set of reasons, you would always get that result. I don't find that super. I find it really interesting and telling. I
think Hobart. That's not his.
That's not his name. No,
his name is.
Right, it's a pseudonym.
Yeah, we know who he is. His name was. He just. He was a philosopher. He just chose a pseudonym for that paper. I could tell you in a second. Yeah,
which was a really very good,
given that it was
famous
such a
paper.
famous, paper.
But so yes, you're right that in the let's say the rollback argument, if you conclude the individuals robbing the poor box was just a matter of luck, that could be problematic because someone could say, as you're right, and Robert Kane really emphasizes this point, that the individual still acted for reasons, and his reasons caused his behavior not in a deviant way, not in a crazy way. He, perhaps he reflected, I really need the money, my children are hungry, and yet it's morally wrong. People gave that money with the intent to, build a new church or whatever. or to, you know, help other people, a number of people who are in need, and my family is not needier than those other people. And then he went back and forth, and in the end, he chose, for his own selfish reasons, to rob the poor box. And it wasn't, as I say, manipulated or caused in a deviant way. He acted for reasons in just the way we ordinarily think is required to ground responsibility. So in that sense, it's not a matter of luck. But in the other sense that you identified, that Al Mealy kind of highlights, the cross-world sense, it does seem to be a matter of luck. There's no difference between the world in which he acts and acts for that reason, the actual world, and the world in which he acts for more altruistic reasons. There's no difference just prior to the act. And he might say, so even though I did act for reasons, and in that sense my act wasn't purely a matter of luck, there was this important residual element that was out of my control. Why, you know, and that's what really is the basis of the work. But you're not moved by that, or let's say, or what would you say about?
I am moved by it. You know, I'm absolutely moved by it. I think it's the biggest problem for the view, for event causal or agent causal views. I am thinking now. You know, so there is this cross-world luck, right? It's a matter of luck that you aid rather than the aid or something like that.
Yeah.
Or that your reasons gave rise to this rather than some other reasons giving rise to some alternative case. I also think, like, so many people have to take in, compatibilists and libertarians, and have to take into account luck at somewhere along the way too. So I mean, well, you know, I didn't get my brakes fixed either, but I just got lucky enough to, you know, not have a little child run out to me. I was like, well, look. Yeah, I mean, you're blameworthy for not checking your brakes. You're not blameworthy for not hitting a kid, because you didn't hit a kid.
Yeah.
But it was just a matter of luck. It wasn't up to you or under your control that a kid ran out in front of the road.
So you're willing.
So you might think, well, where's the difference?
So you're willing to accept luck in a lot of contexts. Just like, I mean, I'm willing to accept constitutive luck, so that I'm willing to say, if some other individual would have developed into a Nazi, if he had stayed in Germany, but he happened to leave early and go to Argentina, he's not blameworthy in the same way that someone who does stay and becomes a Nazi is, even though it's purely a matter of luck, but it's a certain kind of luck. So we all, maybe what you're saying is we all have to accept a certain kind of moral luck, or it's very plausible at some point. So this is where you're willing to bite the bullet and say there is this kind of luck. Is that right?
So yeah, and I think it's most analogous maybe to the luck and consequences of the truck driver cases.
All right, who was next? I forget. Okay, Dimitri, and then Yishai, and then Sophia. Okay, or maybe Sophia next. Okay.
So I think that there are two major points you can make about this. I think that, as you spoke before, moral responsibility in general is a matter of luck in many ways, and no consequences. Like when you drive and, you know, drunk and don't hit a child, and you drive and you hit a child. These are two different. You know, you do the same thing and you actually get different consequences. In one thing, in one situation you can get major consequences, and the other one you may get away with it. So there is more luck even with the determinism. That's the first point. And also there's different kinds of different. Also, there's luck in. For instance, I was thinking about something, and I thought really hard, and when I made the decision to rob the poor box, I mean, I was really hesitating. I was really not sure. I mean, I considered all things, and it's like, so it's like my decision was not a pure evil. I mean, I thought that, well, that's the best alternative. Maybe my estimation was wrong. Maybe you know. So it's also a luck, because in the consequences, you would when I'm blameworthy, when somebody will blame me, he will not be able to see exactly how much effort I put into this process of evaluating the alternatives, and he doesn't know whether I was like really, oh, I just got to rob this box and probably the next one tomorrow and a few others next day. But maybe if I was just a really difficult decision and I had all these moral considerations, maybe I shouldn't be, you know, blameworthy to that extent. But this also, I think, is a matter of luck. So the first point is that moral responsibility is always a matter of luck to a certain degree. But then, but the second point is that you can reduce the agent to a dimensionless point even with determinism. So that's a second. It really matters what you take for as an what you consider an agent. So if you eliminate many things, then you may end up with nothing, and the agent would disappear even with determinism.
Yes.
For
and
instance,
by the way, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So for instance, I don't control my neurons. My neurons make me do this decision. I'm not the neurons, I'm something else. Yeah. Then, you know, the whole agent is eliminated even with determinism.
And Thomas Nagel has a passage in it. Do you? I don't know.
Yeah, you're invoking Nagel when you say dimensionless point, right? Or
invoking something.
Okay,
yeah,
so
but
Nagel says when we take into account all the kinds of luck that feeds into your action, luck and consequences, the area of genuine agency can shrink to an extensionless point.
Extension.
Yeah,
We
good.
disappear.
Yeah,
so it's an
good.
inversion.
So that's a similar, and you're right, determinism.
Okay, so but if you take one of the bigger concepts of the agent, like a center of narrative gravity, for instance, or a pattern of behaviors, you may have a bigger agent, and then you can put the luck inside the agent, inside the box, and the agent wouldn't disappear. Well, Franklin's way is to deal with the issue is one way of doing it. But then I think that it is, a concept of center of narrative gravity also allows to include a matter of this luck inside the agent. And I think that when you come up with alternatives, you do, for instance, you're choosing which bank to rob. You're choosing bank number 1, bank number 2, bank number 3. Well, all of my alternatives are lousy, you know. Well, they're all illegal and they're all blameworthy. Mm-hmm. But if I'm choosing between going to work, donating money to charity, and then going to rob the bank, it's a totally different set of choices. So if I'm coming up with these alternatives, and there's certain luck between the choice, when I choose, there's a certain luck, you know, whether I choose to rob the bank or do the donation. Maybe in my life story, these will smoothen out, so to say. Like if I always make bad alternatives and maybe one good alternative, I'll probably have more of these bad ones in my record, in my life story. But if I have more of the good ones, then even if there's certain unlucky situations when my choice was not the best, then in general, in my lifespan, I would probably have a more smoother ride, and like I could be estimated as a better person. So I think that if we take the Strawson idea of considering the good quality of will, the regard to others, I think in the overall statistics of life, in the way I put the alternatives, I will have like the downfalls, but in general, my life will demonstrate the trend of the quality of will.
So are you suggesting that maybe we can use this narrativity idea to reply to the disappearing agent?
Yes.
Yeah, and something. So it would be another way beside Franklin's. Franklin, for those of you who didn't have a chance to look at it, thinks that that various action theorists, both on the compatibilist and the incompatibilist side, think that you can identify a kind of state as special or unique, as it were, speaking for the agent, as being what speaks for the agent in the sense that it helps to specify autonomy, so that when the you know, I think Isaiah Berlin used the metaphor of an inner citadel. So it's this inner citadel, it's this special designated element. So in Watson's case, it's reason or value. When you act from values, that's what really speaks for you, and you're autonomous. And in Frankfurt's case, it's identification, maybe forming a second. So the second order volition speaks for the agent in some special way. And what he wants to, I mean, Franklin points out that with David Velleman, there's an emphasis on the idea that we have this strong desire or need to make sense of ourselves, to really understand ourselves. And so the desire to understand ourselves is that element of our mental economy that speaks for ourselves in this deep way, acting in accordance with which is what confers autonomy on us. And so what Franklin wants to say is, Pereboom kind of forgets that we could have a designated kind of mental state that speaks especially for the agent. So even if what's happening is you have causation just by events and not agent causation or non-causal facts that are playing a role. Even if it's just events, if one of the events is the designated, of the designated kind that speak especially for the agent, that could solve, the agent then doesn't disappear. She's there, but represented by this special inner citadel, this special, and I think that's an interesting point. And I guess what Dimitri is saying is maybe the designated element could be something that reflects the narrative. Sophia, and then we'll just go. It's okay. We can adjust. But go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a fairly short point. The rollback, you says it's similar to the disappearing agent, but I thought that it's in a way at least one version of the rollback argument, which I think, I'm not quite sure, but I think this version is in the first edition of Robert Kane's Handbook of Free Will. Okay. That is also a little bit similar actually to the four-case manipulation argument against compatibilism. It's like a two-case randomness argument, because in that version we have Alice who deliberates about whether to tell the truth or tell a lie, and then so it's morally relevant. And then we are supposed to imagine that we're situated somehow outside the universe with God watching Alice, and then God like presses the rewind button. And in the first case, it's just indeterminism, you know, there's just a bit of randomness in this world. And God keeps going rewind and play again, and Alice sometimes lies and sometimes tell the truth. And then we're supposed to have the firm intuition that it's just random what she does, that there is no moral responsibility here. And then we just add agent causation, but God keeps, you know, rewinding, pressing play, rewind, play, and it looks exactly the same as before, like nothing really has changed. So therefore there's still no moral responsibility, and that's a little like the same method as in the four-case manipulation argument, although Van Inwagen ends by saying there's got to be something wrong with this argument. Right. Because there is moral responsibility. Yeah,
right. So these arguments, it's good. I think that's a nice thing that we can think about. What's the relationship between manipulation arguments, four-case type argument, even consequence argument, and the rollback and disappearing agent arguments? I mean, in some ways they're similar, in some ways they're different. I mean, one way of thinking of the relationship between the consequence argument and the rollback argument is, the consequence argument basically is raising the problem that if God rolled back the universe to a past time and let it play out, every time, every replay would turn out to be the same. And so that seems to threaten our responsibility. You know, it's like we're screwed either way. You know, if let's say God rewound the universe and let it play out, if every time we do the same thing, that seems to be a problem. That's the problem of necessity. We had to do what we did. Now, introduce the lack of necessity. So God gets to replay the universe. I mean, he winds it back and lets everything rewind. Now, we don't do the same thing every time. That's also a problem. Either way, you know, there's this deep problem for the idea that I make a difference, that either I make a difference or that it's I who's making the difference. Okay, so...
Very short comment.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. It looks like determinism here doesn't undermine moral responsibility, and it like plays no role. It looks like that.
Okay.
Because, all right, he could choose robbing the poor box. He could choose not robbing the poor box, but he didn't have an option to go and rob his own grandmother. So he's probably responsible for both possible outcomes.
Oh, sorry, what did the grandmother have to do? I mean, what was that point? In other words, there are certain, are you saying he had certain options, but at least some things were just ruled out?
Yes, he's responsible for both possible outcomes, but not for those that didn't even come into his mind.
Okay, well that's something.
Yes.
But we can think about the problem supposed to be is that at least if determinism is false, and he does rob the poor box, he's somehow out of control of his action. Not that he doesn't act for reasons, he does act for reasons, but there's no difference between a context where he does that for those reasons and a context where he doesn't rob the poor box for other reasons. There's no difference antecedently that can be traced to his character or him. And that's that cross-world, what is it, the problem of bare trans-world differences. I think that may be the way Mealy puts it, or maybe that's the way I put Mealy's point, but it's the problem of bare trans-world differences. There's a difference that it can't be traced to anything antecedent, and that seems to be worrisome.
Then he's just responsible for both.
Okay. Okay.
This might be like Keynes' point. So Robert Keynes says, look, either way he goes, he has reasons in favor of acting that way. So either way he would be responsible, something like that.
Okay. So what we'll do, we'll take our tea break. Let's return at 20 minutes to the hour. 20 minutes to the hour. Okay?